Hello everyone, welcome to another upload, and I hope that you'll find this one interesting. I'm here with Missy Jen, and as many of you know, on the channel here, we live in Santa Rosa, California. I have been here for in excess of 19 years now, and Jen has been here about 3.5 years, 3.5 years so far. So we feel like we know the area. Myself especially, having traversed a lot of the different regions of the city of Santa Rosa and the county here, I feel like I have a good familiarity with the county. Therefore, I have a good basis for doing this upload. As many of you know, we did a lot of fire videos during the day of the fire. I was certainly out there early in the morning capturing. Didn't exactly know what I was looking at that point in time, but I knew that it was the Great Santa Rosa Fire. And we did a series of very informative, I think the most intensive ground look of after the fire before the lockdowns occurred and you couldn't get into particular areas. We were fortunate enough to be out very early and get in there while the getting was good and do a lot of initial reporting. You know, the news channels give you 3 minutes at night, and that's it. So otherwise, we're giving a half hour on the ground per video. And well, one consequence of all that reporting is we find ourselves in the middle of this controversy that will not go away, Missy Jen. This conspiracy versus natural, you know, a natural occurrence, maybe man-made, but accidentally, versus, you know, we've heard discussions of directed energy weapons. Yeah. People have talked about lasers from the sky. Other people have talked about EMP type of bursts that have come down. And what I want to discuss today, and if I was a lawyer, which I'm not, and I didn't stay at a, don't play one on TV, and I sure didn't stay at a Holiday Inn Express, but I do have a command of some of the facts that maybe some of you don't have, for one thing. And another thing, I am dismayed, and Missy Jen, I have to admit, you're one that, you're skeptical about a lot of things that happen in our country, and you do question authority, and you do question you know, you're not an extremist, but you take everything with a grain of salt that you hear. Right. You always look for alternative explorations. Right. Would you say, and explanations? Would you say that's a fair point?
That's correct.
Yeah, you're not one to go out and just everything is conspiracy and everything is, you know, it's the government versus us. And I just think this upload's going to tie in part and parcel with a lot of what I think ails the country today, and it really has to do with the splintering of what we call news today. That you know, as I was growing up, there were 3 basic television news sources, and then you had your daily newspaper that pulled most of its big stories from the Associated Press or the United Press International. And we had very few. And for the most part, they had professional credentialing. You had to earn your chops to be a reporter. And the fact of the matter is, in most cases, yes, we had bias that maybe existed against, you know, against conservative, liberal bias in the media. For the most part, most people believed what they heard on the news, and they didn't really have a motivation to question what they heard. Well, that's all changed now to a big extent, because anybody with a computer, anybody with a hookup can sit there 3,000, 5,000, 10,000 miles away and second guess what happened in our community right here in Santa Rosa, in what's become the largest and costliest wildfire in the United States history, the Great Santa Rosa Fire. So, Missy Jen, I think that you would agree. We've had a big splintering of reports, and everybody seeks to have their voice heard. And, you know, some people's motivations are very pure, and they want to be very factual with what they report. And at the other end of the spectrum, you have people that are just out there to just trash traditional and government sources and say everything in life is a conspiracy and the government is behind everything that goes wrong. Every shooting, every bombing, every fire, every event, people will try to trace that to something that the government may or may not be doing. Well, that's your right. I mean, freedom of the press is guaranteed, and you rank no lower than anybody else when you choose to do reporting. But often this reporting has agendas that first and foremost is not being factual, but shaping opinion. And in doing so, this is a large part of why I think this country's become so splintered and so ungovernable today. Is we're losing touch with what we can believe in anymore. What is fact? What is fantasy? What is contrived? And what is put out there to either grow the media source or to fulfill an agenda, or to what's the last thing I would say, to even a grudge, to even a score, and to settle a score with government or some other entity. So as a result, we find ourselves as a society very splintered in terms of what we choose to believe. So most people in that situation with a very wide open media field, they tend to gravitate to stories that reinforce their own bias about things that they believe. In other words, if you believe that the government is basically corrupt and that we're all guinea pigs in a laboratory to be used and eventually herded into FEMA camps, well, that's going to be the agenda. But if you believe that our society doesn't have equality in terms of opportunities and incomes, then you're going to sort of take that tact when you do things. So, in my opinion, and the feedback I've gotten from a lot of the fire videos, Missy Jen, is people are banging the drum on the things the way that they want things to be seen. Whether it was the fire began as a directed energy weapon, and then you go look and see those sources, and every story that they cover is always, putting the what I believe to be the truth and taking the other end of that story. So you're growing a huge bumper crop of people in this country that are dyed-in-the-wool conspiracy advocates, that everything is a conspiracy and nothing can ever have a simple explanation.
We have already several fire arsonists that have been arrested. 3 of them already have been arrested that have been proven that 3 fires were set by arsonists.
So let's imagine now that we're in a courtroom, and I am defending, what I believe to be the facts in the case. And you've made your presentation that you can see a laser weapon being deployed, or you can see a directed energy weapon being deployed. Well, now it's my turn to talk, and my turn to present the defense in this case of. And the defense in this case is why this was a naturally occurring event with a man-made catalyst that occurred on that particular night of October 8th, 2017. First thing I want to talk about is a lot of people that don't live in California, and I sure wasn't familiar with it, have no understanding of how different the weather here is from most other places in the United States. You live in Missouri, Jen, you get terrific thunderstorms, you get tornadoes, you get, you've had to ditch blizzards. Out in California, out in California, for the most part, we have weather that's very shielded from what comes down from the north by the Sierra Mountains, and our influence is really off of the Pacific Ocean. So it tends to moderate us, and it tends to do 2 things. It keeps the weather remarkably stable, at least down at sea level for most of the year, with fairly tight variances, except it gets hot in summer, and but it cools off at night. And the second reality is we don't get any rain here in summertime, and this is unusual. I grew up in Baltimore, and we would have thunderstorms or rainy periods in summer, and people used to fret on the Eastern Shore if the corn's not getting enough rain. Well, you don't have that situation because there isn't any at all, nada. So what happens is you get a rainy season, it ends in March or so, and then from April, May, June, July, August, September, October, November, and often into December, you can get 8 to 10 months where you don't get any rain at all. Can you imagine what that does to ground conditions here in California? Think about this. What do you call fires that happen in large woodland areas or large areas in the east? You call them forest fires there. And my friend pointed out this difference to me. In the west, we call them wildfires. The reason is because they can go so out of control, they're so unpredictable, and they can become so massive in scale, mainly because, especially here in California, you don't have the moisture that's going to allow that ground to stay, that's going to retard the growth of the spread of fire. So when something does spark, somebody pulls off of a highway and their muffler touches, they're off on the shoulder, and the muffler maybe or the catalytic converter touches some grass, and before you know it, there's a grass fire moving, sweeping up the hill very quickly. So number one, you've got to know that our weather is different out here in California. And what happened on that night of October 8th was a very freak wind situation that came up, to the extent that Missy Jen was already in bed. And I remember I came in at 9 o'clock because I go to bed a couple hours after she does. And I said, I am really worried tonight that these trees, we have these big redwoods next to the house, like four soldiers, the biggest trees in the neighborhood. And I said, it's going to kind of be a miracle tonight if we don't get flattened by one of those trees. It was so incredibly windy that night. Now, we're not generally known as a windy area here. Right. This is a calm area, but this was one of these cold fronts that came through with tremendous force, and that cold front had the high winds associated with it, and they were also very dry. They were sweeping off of the desert of Nevada, and they were sucking up. They were taking the relative humidities down to 14%, very low, 14, 18%, super low. So it was almost like a static electricity type of environment when that came sweeping through. So you know about the climate out here now and how that could potentially contribute to trouble when it comes to fire. Number two, when that wind event occurred at 9:40 p.m., Pacific Gas and Electric, within 10 minutes, logged our gas and electric company, Pacific Gas and Electric in Northern California. They logged 10 event calls within the first 10 minutes from people saying either power was out or they had seen a blue flash and heard an explosion. And typically that's associated, as I've seen with earthquakes when I look out the window when it's occurring, it occurs when a transformer explodes or a power line disconnects from a transformer and temporarily grounds on something. The voltages are so high that you get blue sparks. You don't get yellow ones, you get blue ones, because you're talking about the kilovolts here as opposed to household power. Now, PG&E has hundreds of miles of power lines running up here, correct? Yeah. They can't possibly protect them from tree growth every mile along the way. You'd almost need an army to be able to patrol that. And on the evening of the 8th of October, unfortunately, one of those trees came down over near Tubbs Lane, and I think they're going to find this is the ultimate cause, and it swept into a power line and knocked it down and began a ground fire. It took off from that point and, driven by a wind coming from the northeast, began to spread to the towards Santa Rosa from Calistoga, California, from Calistoga in Napa County. And this was driven at that time by 35 to 45 mile an hour winds, with higher peaks being measured on the gusts. So, like it or not, the reality is the power lines did come down in that particular area. Number three, we had an El Nino winter last year, which meant that we had the rainiest weather we've ever had We had the Oroville Dam was almost busted. It was almost
it
destroyed.
was running over the brim.
Yeah, it was topping. The dam
It was
topping.
topping the emergency spillway and washed out the dam to where it nearly
Nearly eroded away and just
eroded
busted
away
through.
and broke through the dam. Yeah.
Well, the reality of that happening was we had a tremendous amount of spring growth on the ground of what eventually becomes what they call out west chaparral, or dried weeds and things out here. And they're very dense on the hillside, and they make a beautiful like carpet of fire material that can run up and down hills. So this contributed a lot. This record rains that we had contributed a lot to our abnormal amounts of ground vegetation that dried out there. Okay? So we had that ground fuel. There was plenty of ground fuel as a result of that El Nino. The fifth point is we have population density up there, and we have great fuel. And the ground, the stuff on the ground that I was talking about, the chaparral that grows there and dries, is a very fast consumed fuel. It's used within a minute or two, you've used that. So when that fire is sweeping down the hill, it's got to ignite something. And we'll talk about the trees in a minute, but now, since the early 1980s, there's been a heavy population growth up on the hills, and this was something that was very heavily debated back in the early 1980s when houses started appearing up on the ridges between Napa and Sonoma County. There were some people very upset, and there were people that went to some of the city council meetings in 1984 and warned, you know, and we'll talk about history repeating itself, but warned that if we develop in this area up here called Fountain Grove, then we're going to potentially have problems. Well, developers went out, and, you know, you have Fountain Grove developed with hundreds and hundreds of very expensive homes on that hill, with people planting what they hope are trees that are relatively fireproof, and they have lawns and things, but at the end of the day, you know, Jen, when that fire sweeps over, it's like, and it starts to pick up a house or two. Now you got some real fuel. Now you got some real fuel.
You don't have fireproof houses.
Yeah, you got some real fuel to start kicking out some real embers driven by 40, 50, by this time 50-mile-an-hour wind sweeping down. So now you got plenty of fuel up in those hills with hundreds and hundreds of houses. I talked about 1984, how the city council developed whether to even, debated whether to even develop those hills above Santa Rosa, and the developers won. Now, the reason more trees didn't go up was because, as I said, this chaparral moves and burns so quickly, and a lot of these trees are green, the trunks and things like that. It caught a lot of the leaves, but the fire has already moved on, and there's not enough left to really fully engulf a tree. If you've ever burned green wood, which is what these trees basically are, then you know you practically have to put a torch to it for an hour to try to get that thing to ignite.
Right.
So when this ground fuel moves, is consumed and is moving forward at, faster than a person can run down the hill, there's not enough time, and plus when the wind blows afterward, it's snuffing out what little flames did manage to get started on the tree. But what's still flaming up like crazy is the houses, because they're very dry, they have a large component of wood to them, and they're catching embers coming down the hill, not only from the chaparral burning, but also the houses across the street. Further up the hill, there's all kinds of fuel in those homes that can have flames leaping 30, 40, 50 feet driven by those winds. Number 6, that is very difficult terrain up in those hills. If you've ever seen those hillsides, you don't just send a fire crew. There's access problems of getting up there to even fight fires once they break loose. So this will tie into the initial response that occurred overnight on the 8th into the 9th of October on the part of the sheriffs and the fire departments. The number 7 I have here, there was an out-of-scale fire response, and by that I mean we're used to fighting traditional size fires here when they occur. And this fire exploded so wide and caught so much fuel coming over the hill with all those developments and all those houses and stuff, that by the time the Berkeley Fire Department arrived in the wee hours of the 9th of October, they were told when they were contacted, you know, multi-alarm, we need help from outside the whole region. They thought they were coming up to fight a small brush fire. But in fact, when they rolled into Santa Rosa, they saw that fire was on both sides of Highway 101. As far as they could see in either direction, everything was in flames. So what I'm talking about, an out-of-scale response, was there wasn't enough firefighters in the United States to have tackled and stopped this fire when that began. So the response that did happen was, we got to get people the hell out of the path of the fire.
Saving people.
We can't fight. You know, we can send some crews way over to the west side of the city in hopes of establishing a line where they hope the fire won't cross. But in the meantime, we've got thousands of people in these hills and in these communities and in these flatland areas that are now exposed to this fire that's racing down the hill right into the heart of Santa Rosa. So evacuating people became a priority. There wasn't any fire being fought, you know, on the east side of town once things got out of control. It was sheriffs running around in firestorms trying to yell and get people into cars, because the fire was so out of scale to what traditional firefighting could respond to, that it overwhelmed everybody. Okay? Now the big thing is the motivation. Okay? What would motivate number one, why would Santa Rosa of all cities be chosen for an exercise in unleashing a laser or a directed energy weapon? What makes Santa Rosa a test bed for doing that, as opposed to maybe Buffalo, New York, or Salt Lake City, Utah? You know, and what is the motivation of the government to destroy its own, you know, an area equivalent to the size of Manhattan with $3.5 billion of property damage, that the government's going to probably end up paying half of that?
Right.
You know, so I question the motivation of why, when people say it was a directed energy weapon or it was the government causing this to happen, I have to say to them, what's the motivation and why this city in particular? Now, the motivation on your side, though, the conspiracy side, is easy. You're motivated to grow your following, grow the ranks of the conspiracy theory believers. So your motivations are much more easily perceived and understood than a government that would direct a weapon at a random city in California to do some random damage to. Okay, so your motivations on the other side are much easier for people to understand than being on the government side, saying it was a government directed operation. The most damning piece of evidence that undermines the theory that this was a directed energy weapon or a laser or some type of satellite beam from space that came down was the exact same thing happened here in 1964. We had what was called the Hanley fire that began in almost the exact same area at the exact same time of year, because a hunter behind a bar flicked a cigarette that lit a fire, and within hours that fire had raced over the top of the hills from Napa into Sonoma County and come down almost to the very heart of Santa Rosa. Now, what was different now was there wasn't any fuel in the hills in terms of homes, in terms of businesses. There was just that chaparral on the ground. So they were able, actually students from the junior college were able to go up and help fight the fire at that time, because there weren't homes up there. There wasn't any development up there. So if you look at the 1964 Hanley fire and you put, and at the end of this, I'll show the picture of the overlay of the two footprints of those fires, you will see that they are almost identical in terms of where they started, how they spread, and where they ultimately ended within the city of Santa Rosa. Tragically, of course, this fire did leap. You know, we had hotels that caught fire up on the hills, a lot of fuel, and a lot of embers came from a higher altitude and went across Highway 101 and ignited the mobile home park, and then further jumped from there over to Coffee Park and destroyed that area. But it all has to do with high density population at that point, and a lot of fuel to consume within a city is it's a lot better than trees sitting out on the hills. I can tell you that with Chaparral. So on that note, I'm going to really rest my case on this and say, you know, I think the preponderance of evidence is pretty clear that this was not a government directed, despite attempts of people that may truthfully and honestly believe it was so, or people that are just charlatans and want to perpetuate myths of, you know, and stereotypes of big brothers out to get us and that type of thing. But it certainly, we can understand with all this splintered reporting and all this armchair analysis from far away, we can certainly understand how people in our country start to get ideas in their heads that lead to a splintering within our nation. And to me, it's kind of sad because it's making this country more and more ungovernable in that regard. And we seem to wonder as a society why we're so split up into so many factions now in this country. Well, one of the reasons is we really don't have any fact checkers in that reporting anymore, and anything goes. So it's our little part to kind of fight back here. Thank you for watching. This was a long one. Thank you, Missy Jen, for your help, and she's been out with me every step of the way, here and seeing things firsthand herself. And I want to thank you, honey, for your help today. So thank you all for watching. Hope you enjoyed this bit of an overview. Your thumbs up are appreciated, or make your comments below. And if you disagree, sure, this is the appropriate way to do it. We can have differences of opinions, but we can have differences when it comes to facts. Okay, thanks so much for watching, everyone.
Thank you.